Okay, so we have a few hundred participants, and we anticipate more. But for the sake of everyone's time and our schedule, I'll go ahead and get started. Dr. Bright, are you ready? I'll do a welcome message and then introduce you and turn it over. Good morning, everyone. Wow, I love seeing your faces. So it is an immense honor to welcome you to our training on trauma-informed care. We have a fantastic expert joining us today. And first, I just want to say that we literally have people dialing in from all over the world, Kuala Lumpur, Great Britain, people from all over the United States. And so it is an immense honor to bring this training to you. It is sponsored by the Patulik Foundation in partnership with Resilient Georgia. And the goal for this training locally, but then also wherever it can have impact worldwide, is to invest in whatever legacy of trauma-informed care you have created in your communities, but then also equip a new series of champions. I can think of no more important time in our collective history to pause for a morning and just acknowledge the difficulty that many folks in the world have experienced. I think you'll be surprised today by how trauma is defined and by how very likely more people, a higher percentage of people, have experienced trauma than you might expect. Dr. Bride will be sharing his very scientific and experienced understanding about this. But just let me say that there is no better and no more important time to pause what we're doing and take a moment for compassion. Your investment this morning is going to increase your understanding of your own experience with trauma, which is what we call secondary trauma, as well as the trauma experiences of your neighbors. And so what you can look forward to today is to leave this training with increased understanding and greater compassion for the people around you. It will shift your perspective from, when challenged by a circumstance, asking what's wrong with you, to asking instead what happened to you. So Dr. Bride is joining us as the professor and director of the School of Social Work at Georgia State University. He actually developed the secondary traumatic stress scale. He's received a number of honors as a result of his research on secondary traumatic stress, including the Creative Research Medal from the University of Georgia. He was named a distinguished scholar by the Center for Social Research at the University of Buffalo, and had an article identified in the British Journal of Social Work as the 6th most influential social work article in the prior decade. He received his MSW from Florida State University, his MPH from Harvard School of Public Health, and his PhD from our very own University of Georgia. Dr. Bride, it is such an honor to share the morning with you. I will turn the training over to you. Participants, just know we will have a couple of breaks scheduled. So do not fear, you will have breaks coming your way. Without further ado, Dr. Bride, thank you and good morning.
Thank you, Erin. I appreciate this opportunity. I just want to set the stage a little bit. As you mentioned, I'm a social worker by training, public health worker as well. I know this is a very large and diverse audience, so I'm going to try, one of my goals is to be fairly general with what we're talking about, but it is likely I'll revert to social work speak from time to time. So just bear with me with that. Okay, let's, Jacob, can you move the slide? All right, so let me just first start with my primary objectives, give you an idea of what we are doing in this training. First, I'm going to start out with looking at defining trauma, traumatic events, and the range of reactions to traumatic experiences and traumatic stress. Look at how that plays out in the short term, immediate term, and long term. I want to talk a little bit about resiliency and post-traumatic growth as well, because a lot of the issues I'll be talking about can come across as very negative, but there's also some positive aspects that are important to acknowledge. And then I want to talk about trauma-informed care and what that is. Just describe what that is and how that may fit in the work that you do. And then talk about the potential, as Aaron said, the impact of trauma on individuals who aren't directly experiencing the trauma. So people who are serving those who've been traumatized, or even if you're family and friends with someone who's been traumatized. And then end really with looking at how you can take care of yourselves. What's the role of self-care in preventing secondary trauma and the negative impact of trauma on yourself, okay? All right, so what is trauma? So this is a definition from SAMHSA. If you're not familiar with SAMHSA, it's one of the largest substance use mental health agencies in the federal government. And this is a consensus statement that brought together about 40 experts from all sorts of fields. And what they decided was that trauma results from an event, series of events, or set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening, and that has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning, mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. And so what we're going to do for the next few minutes is talk about what those impacts are and how those play out in different individuals. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Okay. So I think before I even define the trauma, it's really important for me to convey that trauma has a very specific definition. Not every highly stressful event can actually be considered a trauma. Highly stressful events can have their own negative impact. Some of them can be very similar to what we're talking about today. But what I really want to talk about is specifically what trauma is and how that impact can occur. So by definition, a traumatic event occurs when an individual is exposed to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. And the individual can either directly experience that trauma, so the trauma occurs to them, or they're present when the trauma occurs, so they witness it. There's also indirect trauma. So as we begin to talk about secondary traumatic stress, that's what that talks about. And that can occur by learning that a relative or close friend was exposed to a trauma and hearing their stories, or even just imagining what they might have gone through. And then the area that I do a lot of research in is indirect exposure to adverse details of the trauma in the course of professional duties. And there's a wide range of professions that can be impacted by secondary trauma or by trauma. As I mentioned, I'm a social worker. I do work with nurses, physicians, teachers, school social workers, certainly child welfare professionals. This is something that occurs with EMT professionals, really anyone who's involved with social services or health services can be exposed to trauma. So some examples of what those events might be. Things like physical or sexual assault or abuse, a mugging, a fight, certainly domestic or interpersonal violence fits. Community violence, so living in a community that has a high rate of violence, it can be a chronic stressor. Natural or human-caused disasters, of course, things like tornadoes, hurricanes, earthquakes, flooding, technological accidents such as motor vehicle accidents or industrial accidents, accidents on the farm, for instance. The sudden death of a parent, a child, or a partner can be deemed traumatic based on the individual response. Serious injury or illnesses and combat-like situations are some of the most common things that we look at when we talk about traumatic events. So one of the things that I think is important for us to know, because I know not all of you are direct care providers or social workers, many of you come from all different areas of life. One of the things that is important to convey is how widespread trauma is. So from one study, 61% of men and 51% of women report exposure to at least one trauma within their lifetime. And many of those will report multiple traumas. This is where I might ask you all to hold up your hands if you've experienced a trauma, but we're not going to do that. Within my own field of social work and behavioral health, 90% of people presenting for services in public behavioral health care settings have experienced trauma. And 98% of social workers serve clients who have experienced trauma. And those statistics are pretty consistent across all sorts of areas. So, if you serve homeless individuals, nearly all of them have experienced a trauma. If you work with domestic violence survivors, all of them have experienced trauma. In child welfare, most clients experience trauma. In the healthcare field, lots of people have experienced trauma in one form or another. So trauma is very prevalent in society. We're going to talk in a minute about the negative effects, and so there, and how those traumas can turn into something that's negative for the individual. So there's this slide says the 3 E's of trauma. So we like to talk about, there's the trauma as the event. So trauma is something that occurs, and people experience it. People experience it in different ways, however. For some people, an event that I have, for instance, that I just defined as traumas may actually not be traumatic for that individual. So it's part of it is how the individual perceives the trauma. What's their immediate reaction to the event? What is the meaning they make of it? And a lot of this can be unconscious. And then the third aspect of trauma is the effect that it has. And so is the effect of that trauma based on the event and the experience that the individual has had, does that result in a negative, a positive impact, both? It can be a number of things. So let's talk some about what those effects may be. Okay, so there are different ways of talking about trauma, and these are just some of them. One is acute trauma. So acute trauma is a trauma that is essentially a one-time trauma. It happens, it occurs, and then it's gone. That would be, so something like a motor vehicle accident or a random act of violence would be an acute trauma. Chronic traumas, on the other hand, are recurring events that occur over a prolonged period of time. So chronic trauma would be this faced by someone, for instance, who's in a relationship where interpersonal violence is part of it. So they're and as long as they remain in that relationship, that trauma continues to occur. It could be community violence, living in a neighborhood that is highly violent, living in a area that is under is in war or warlike situations, for instance. Those would be chronic traumas. A complex trauma typically involves multiple instances and multiple forms of trauma. Excuse me. So by multiple instances of trauma, I mean there's either they experience different traumatic events, either sequentially, one after another, or sometimes different traumatic events occurring at the same time. So for instance, the 2 examples I just gave of interpersonal violence and living in a violent community, both of those may go hand in hand. And the person's experiencing chronic trauma in 2 different ways, one on an interpersonal level as IP, and then the other as just their primary living situation. So this is considered complex trauma. It involves multiple types of trauma across different types of domains. Fourth way that we look at trauma is something called intergenerational and or historical trauma. And this is really typically complex and collective trauma experienced over time and often across generations by a group of people who share an identity, affiliation, or circumstance. So some examples would be Native Americans have experienced historical trauma based on the way the U.S. government has treated them and movement to different reservations and death and so on. African Americans in the South, Japanese Americans during World War II internment, for instance. Certainly Jewish people based on the history of the Holocaust and other persecutory measures. So those are things where it begins to invade the cultural identity of those individuals based on what's happened to people in their communities, even in the past. So for instance, there's research documenting that grandchildren of Holocaust survivors sometimes exhibit post-traumatic stress symptoms based on the experiences of their grandparents and great-grandparents. The other thing I want to mention, and I'll come back to this again later, is the notion of shared trauma. So shared trauma is when a professional, like a social worker, for instance, is experiencing or hearing about the traumas of their clients or others at the same time that they are experiencing a large-scale kind of community-wide trauma themselves. So example of that would be like in the aftermath of a disaster, where an individual may provide services, whether it be clinical services, housing, or just be a friend or family taking care of that individual who experienced a trauma, or it may be an acute trauma within that larger disaster, but also the professional has experienced that trauma themselves. So it's a process of experiencing the trauma of the people that you're working with, as well as it taking on their negative aspects of trauma. All right, so let's talk about some of the long-term reactions of trauma. Actually, Jacob, can you go forward again? All right, I got them out of order. So let's let's talk about it. So what are some signs of a trauma reaction? Trauma can occur in multiple ways. We like to talk about the emotional reactions that may occur. Hold on. So anxiety, fear, shame, powerlessness, helplessness, worry, and anger are all common emotional reactions that occur post trauma or based on the long-term impacts of trauma. Many people experience physical or somatic reactions. So the way they experience stress and experience trauma is really through their body. So they may have nausea, may have lightheadedness, headaches, stomach aches, an increase in heart rate, respiration, or breath holding. So there's this physical response, whether or not they consciously recognize that the trauma had occurred or is negatively impacting them. Some of the behavioral reactions certainly would be crying, being uncooperative, being argumentative, unresponsive, and restless. And cognitive reactions include memory impairment or forgetfulness, inability to give adequate history. So one of the things to know about trauma is often people in the aftermath of the trauma and for a long period of time either may completely not remember the trauma in the most serious cases, but certainly may not recall specific details about the trauma. Details about if there was a perpetrator, what he or she looked like, about what time it occurred, what situation, and those sorts of things. So the way they think about and process the trauma may be impacted. Okay. So there we go. That's what I was trying to do. Okay. All right. So One of the things that I think is really important to highlight is that, as I mentioned earlier, trauma occurs. Trauma is a very common occurrence. Most of us on this webinar have experienced some sort of trauma in our lives at least once, right? Um, so that's part of life. That's part of our experience. When a severe trauma occurs, let's say a natural disaster or a terrorist event, most of us will have an immediate reaction like those ones I just mentioned. So it's a normal reaction to traumatic events to have an initial negative reaction, to respond with fear, to respond with anxiety, to have difficulty sleeping, to have dreams about the event. So most of us would experience something like that. On the other hand, over a period of weeks and months, most of us will start having less and less negative impact of the trauma. So that it just kind of naturally goes away. We begin to cope and we begin to move on. But for a small percentage of people, they continue to experience problems, and in the most extreme, may be diagnosed with something called post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a diagnosable mental health disorder that is tied to experiencing a traumatic event. And so what I'm going to do here on this slide is kind of talk about what those different aspects are. I'm sorry, Jacob, can you go forward one or two? I want to see one more. One more. Okay, one more. Sorry, I forgot my slides. All right, okay, go back 5 again. Sorry, folks. All right, so next slide. I'm going to come back to these long-term reactions of trauma. We did that next. Okay, so in a broad sense, that long-term impact of trauma can result in things like a negative self-view. So the trauma can cause a person to review themselves negatively, to feel helpless, to feel guilty about the event even occurring to them. So for instance, many sexual assault survivors feel guilty or ashamed, though they were the ones that were perpetrated against, right? So they may blame themselves for being in a situation that they feel they shouldn't have been, or by sending mixed signals. That's a common reaction of having negative self-view that comes in the aftermath of trauma. So also, trauma survivors often see themselves as different from other people in a number of different ways. A second way that trauma may impact is really to change the way the individual changes their beliefs and changes their worldview. So there's a researcher named Ronnie Janoff Bowman who many years ago wrote a book called Shattered Assumptions. And that book really talks about this aspect of it. And what her thesis is that as humans, we at some point in our lives have a kind of, we have these basic assumptions about how the way the world works and how we interact with the world. And that at some point we've all had this kind of assumption that the world is basically a safe place, that people are basically good people, that good things happen to good people and bad things don't. And when we're faced with a traumatic event, that shatters those assumptions. So if we've been assaulted or abused, or we know someone who has been, that shows us that the world is not safe and that bad things can happen to good people. And that really changes the way we look at the world. And that may be part of what results in the other negative impacts of traumatic stress. Emotional regulation difficulties are very common in the aftermath of trauma. So these conditions, it's people not being able to regulate particularly negative emotions, anger, fear, anxiety, those sorts of things. These conditions cause people to lose control over their emotions. And so they may really experience intense anger, intense sadness, may cry, to the extreme of feeling suicidal is a possibility. Relationship issues certainly can come in the aftermath of a traumatic event. Relationships may suffer due to difficulties trusting and interacting because of this negative self-view we talked about before. Certainly the emotional regulation difficulties may impact on individuals on an interpersonal level. People may develop unhealthy relationships because they are with the person. They may develop unhealthy relationships based on their experience of the trauma. Part of that is a notion I'll talk about some when we talk about the particular symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, but that's reenactment. So it's not uncommon for people who've experienced traumas to put themselves in the place where they might experience that trauma again. Detachment from the trauma is a common impact of trauma. So where the person really kind of disassociates or feels detached from their emotions or physical sensations in the aftermath of trauma. Some may completely forget the trauma, as I've mentioned before. So kind of having amnesia or repressing those memories, often because those memories are embedded with negative emotions, can be part of the picture. For those who've been traumatized through a crime or some act where there's been a perpetrator, they may have a preoccupation with the abuser. It is not uncommon that they might fixate on the abuser, often in a negative way, but sometimes in a kind of ironic way, in feeling positively toward them. The relationship with the abuser, or they may actually feel preoccupation with getting revenge for the abuse as well. There are also a range of behavioral or physical health problems that may be related to experiencing a trauma. Behavioral things, I've mentioned PTSD, we're going to go into that in more detail, but there are other things such as depression may result in anxiety. Commonly, people who have experienced trauma have misused substances for a period of time or may end up in full-blown addiction. On the other end, I used to do a lot. I worked in substance abuse treatment for a number of years. Most individuals seeking treatment for substance abuse have experienced at least one, if not multiple, significant traumas in their lifetime. And the use of alcohol or other drugs is a way for them to kind of self-medicate the feelings and the reactions that they're having. Behaviorally, sometimes people who experience trauma may engage in self-harm behaviors. And some suicidality, I think I mentioned before. Self-harm and suicidality are not necessarily the same thing. Many people who self-harm are not interested in ending their life, though many of us may perceive that, but it is a behavior such as cutting that it may occur following traumatic events. Insomnia is a common problem in the aftermath of trauma as well. Now, there's in the last 10 years and longer, actually, there's been a lot of research into the physical health aspects of trauma, that experiencing a trauma, and these physical impacts may occur with or without the behavioral impact. So even someone who appears to have emotionally and behaviorally weathered the trauma and come out without those negative aspects, because of the somatization, may be also still experience physical health problems due to the underlying stress. So a history of trauma is seen as a risk factor for things as wide and varied as diabetes, heart disease, high blood pressure, obesity, cancer, liver disease, unattended pregnancies, pain conditions, gastrointestinal disorders. So there's all sorts of physical manifestations of trauma. And again, I want to underline that those may occur with or without any acknowledgement that trauma had a negative effect on them, or in some cases that they experienced trauma. So those same people who may not recall that they were traumatized, those may be the minority of people who've been traumatized, may experience the physical impact of that. Okay. Oh, see, I had a whole slide for that. I'm sorry. All right. Let's go next. Next, I think we, go ahead. I'll go forward a little bit more. Go one more. All right, folks. So I have those blank slides because that's my timing cue, and I'm way ahead of time. So when we go to the next one, we'll have a break in a little while. So what I want to highlight now is I've mentioned a couple times post-traumatic stress disorder. So PTSD is really an extreme reaction to experiencing a traumatic event. Amongst the general population, so all of those, everyone in the world, well, let's say within the United States, the rate of lifetime PTSD is 7 to 8%. So I mentioned long ago that at least half of us have, at least half the population have experienced at least one trauma in their lives. But it's 50% do not develop post-traumatic stress disorder. So the number of people who experience the most extreme aspect of traumatic events is much smaller than those who experience trauma. And I think that's a really important concept for everyone to understand. Trauma does not equal post-traumatic stress disorder. And there's a range of experiences. So post-traumatic stress disorder is a diagnosable mental disorder where you have to where the individual must exhibit very specific symptoms across a range of domains. And it is possible and actually quite common that people may experience some of the symptoms, but not the full range of those symptoms. So I think what's really important to know that there's this continuum of experiences of trauma that individuals may have. So I want to encourage you not to think if someone's been traumatized and either doesn't have a problem or has PTSD. There's a large range of aspects of that. Okay. All right, so let's talk about the exposure. We've mentioned this a little bit earlier. So exposure to trauma, how do we experience trauma, can happen a couple ways. So directly experiencing the event. So being the person who has been assaulted or abused, who's been shot at, who's been mugged, who has gone through a tornado or a hurricane, or been engaged in combat, or experienced the aftermath of combat in other people. So directly experience a traumatic event is one way to be traumatized. Witnessing the event in person, so being a bystander to someone else's trauma is one way to be exposed. So that is, seeing a motor vehicle accident and the aftermath of that may be a very significant trauma for an individual. Children who witness domestic violence within their home, whether or not they're experiencing their own physical abuse, the witness of the abuse between their parents can be traumatic in and of itself, whether or not they're being abused themselves. So directly witnessing and directly experiencing, directly witnessing in the past, those were preconditions for experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder or traumatic stress symptoms. So we used to think that someone had to directly experience or witness a traumatic event to develop traumatic stress reactions. We've since done a lot of research and found out that that's not the case, that extends to indirect or secondary traumatic stress. So that family members and friends, for instance, of an individual who's been traumatized may experience traumatic stress. So their trauma is the trauma that their family or friend experienced. So without directly experiencing or witnessing the event, they hear about or even just imagine what the individual went through. There's a great deal of research that looks into this. I mentioned earlier about intergenerational trauma, the transmission of traumatic stress from Holocaust survivors down at least 2 generations to their grandchildren. There's a lot of research on both the spouses as well as the children of combat veterans that experience trauma that really plays out as if they had experienced the combat trauma, not just necessarily a reaction to the person who was in combat acting out in anger or fear. So there are spouses of sexual assault survivors sometimes experience PTSD or traumatic stress as well. So family and friends and community members can be traumatized or exposed to trauma indirectly. Now, the other aspect then is people who are in professional or volunteer situations where they experience sorry, that is a typo. Okay. So the people who experience indirectly trauma through their profession. So for instance, I'm a social worker. When working with my clients, a lot of the clients I've worked with in the past have experienced some level of trauma. Many of the clients I work with, as I mentioned in a previous slide, 90% of social workers work with individuals who've been traumatized. That trauma of the individuals I'm working with can be transmitted to me through the professional actions that I'm taking. So for instance, conducting an intake assessment or a psychosocial assessment, I would inquire about the traumas that someone might experience, and I'll get details about that. And whether I get, depending on the situation I'm in and the profession that I'm in, I may get very significant details, very, very detailed story, or may just be looking at whether they've been traumatized at all, but I may begin to imagine what that trauma has been based on either my past professional experience or just what I imagine. And so those are different ways to be exposed to trauma that may lead you to having traumatic stress symptoms. Okay, one more. So there are several domains of symptoms that occur that I mentioned. To be diagnosed with PTSD, you must have a certain number of symptoms in a certain number of domains. One of those domains is what we call re-experiencing symptoms. Sometimes we talk about this in terms of intrusion symptoms. And these are things like recurrent, involuntary, intrusive, distressing memories of the event. So imagine you're going into the grocery store, rolling your cart down the produce aisle. You're someone who has experienced a random act of violence, a mugging or so. So you're shopping, not thinking about that mugging, not thinking about that trauma that occurred to you. You're checking out the produce, but then all of a sudden an image of the person pops into your mind, or you feel like you saw them behind you and you look behind you. And these can become much more intense than that. So it's recurrent, intrusive memories or reminders of the traumatic event. This can particularly occur, one of the most common symptoms is by having distressing dreams about in which the content and or the affect or the emotional feel of the dream are related to the traumatic event. So that's very common, particularly in the immediate aftermath of a trauma. Many of us will wake up with dreams about a trauma. Long-term, those dreams distressing dreams may continue to occur and become bothersome to the individual, or particularly interrupt their sleep to the point that they become insomniacs. I mentioned before dissociative reactions. So this is when the individual feels or acts as if the trauma were recurring. So they literally will feel emotionally as if the trauma may be occurring again, or may physically act in a way like the trauma has occurred again. And particularly with children, these reactions may occur in the repetitive play that seems to be violent. Re-experiencing symptoms also has to do with having psychological distress at reminders of the traumatic event. So intense or prolonged psychological distress at exposure to internal or external cues. So we may have thoughts or feelings or emotions that we have linked to the traumatic event that we've had. But there also may be things outside of us, things that we see, things that we feel in terms of like the weather, the darkness, the place that we're in, people who look like a perpetrator if it's a perpetrated trauma. So by experiencing these reminders, or we might call them triggers, someone may then experience the psychological aspects we've talked about, may experience anger, may experience fear, anxiety, shame, anything like that. Similarly, there may be physiological reactions to those sorts of triggers as well. So hearing about, hearing something or seeing something or thinking something that's a reminder of the traumatic event may cause an increased heart rate, for instance, may cause excessive sweating, so sweating brow, sweating hands, heart palpitations, nausea, body aches, pain, migraine headaches, or headaches in general, may be a reaction to the intrusive thought of the trauma through those internal or external triggers. Okay. All right, next. Avoidance symptoms. Avoidance is the avoidance of or efforts to avoid distressing memories, thoughts, or feelings about or closely associated with the traumatic event. So I think as we're going through this, I want to underline that part of the process of the traumatic stress reaction is an individual experiences a trauma that has both a immediate physiological and psychological or emotional reaction to the event. And those physiological and emotional reactions become tied to that traumatic event. So in a previous slide, we're really talking about those feelings physiologically and physically intruding on how we operate in the world, into our consciousness at different ways. Because of that process, because we've experienced these negative events and are really continuing to relive them in different ways through intrusion and re-experiencing symptoms, many individuals begin to develop a coping mechanism, which initially is coping, can be very helpful to avoid those thoughts, avoid memories, to avoid feelings that are associated with the traumatic event. There is also efforts to avoid external reminders, so people, places, conversations, activities, anything that may remind them of that event. Again, going back to the previous slide, often these reminders are really anchored in physiological or psychological reactions, which are very uncomfortable and that people want to avoid. So that's part of the process that is both a normal reaction to trauma, but as those avoidance symptoms stick around, they can become dysfunctional. And that's where we begin to see some problems. So if avoidance of maybe an extreme example would be a woman who's experienced a sexual assault result in avoiding a wide swath, if not all men, or all men who look like that individual in some form or another. So in one sense, we can see that as a functional reaction, but then it begins to interfere with social, interpersonal, maybe occupational roles. Okay, Next. Okay, so then negative cognitions and mood. And yes, great, I see another typo. So uh, I've mentioned multiple times that there's often a amnestic quality. There's an inability to remember an important aspect of the traumatic event. So either details or fully forgetting the traumatic event. And in the case of completely forgetting the traumatic event, that's something that can last quite a long time, or it can last forever, or there may be a point down the road where those memories come flooding back, where all of a sudden the person remembers the trauma. A second aspect of cognition's mood is persistent and exaggerated negative beliefs or expectations about oneself, about others, or the world. So remember a little ways back, I talked about Ronnie Janoff Bowman, who wrote the book Shattered Assumptions. And so what she says is, as those assumptions are shattered, we develop different views about ourself, about others in the world. For instance, if I've been traumatized, I may blame myself. I may see myself as a bad person, or as having done something wrong, when that's not the case. I also may see others as danger, or to be distrustful of others. And again, there's a certain level of that would be functional with any human interaction. But when that becomes pervasive, it interferes with the individual's ability to really interact with the world in their social lives, their occupational lives, their educational lives. And so that's where it can really begin to become a problem. Individuals may have persistent, distorted cognitions, meaning thoughts about the cause or consequence of the traumatic event, that lead the individual to blame himself or others in a way that may be inappropriate or certainly inaccurate. So as I mentioned, people who have experienced perpetrated traumas may often blame themselves, or blame someone for putting them in that situation. So a spouse may be blamed, a parent may be blamed, a friend may be blamed, those sorts of things. And of course, there's maybe a persistent negative emotional state. So individuals who are experiencing traumatic stress may persistently come across as or experience depression, anxiety, very common when it's a perpetrated trauma, like physical assault or abuse, sexual abuse. They may experience anger, shame. There may be irritability as a part of the way they react to the world. And this is kind of a maybe intermittent, but it may also be very persistent negative emotional state. One aspect of cognitions of mood is that individuals who've been traumatized may experience markedly diminished interest or participation in significant activities. So really they will withdraw socially, withdraw from their family, withdraw from their friends. Many people people may describe that the only people they want to interact with are their immediate family members, for instance. Or they may withdraw from different things that they enjoyed. So hobbies, community events, all sorts of different things that the person previously enjoyed, they may withdraw from and isolate from. And that's a common sign of PTSD, as well as depression and other things that may be occurring. There's a feeling of detachment or estrangement from others that may occur, particularly when traumas occur that are perpetrated by an individual, that are the result of someone traumatizing someone else, either consciously or purposely or not. So individuals who've been traumatized often withdraw from people and don't feel like their relationships are as close as they used to be, and may even have kind of combative or negative relations with people that they previously were very close to. And we've talked about having persistent negative emotional states. There's also this phenomena of perhaps not having negative states, but not being able to experience positive emotions either. So with or without negative emotions, the person doesn't experience joy, has difficulty laughing, has difficulty just having fun. So any sort of positive emotion becomes problematic. Arousal symptoms, and we often refer to these as hyperarousal, because arousal symptoms are symptoms that we all have. They're part of our DNA. It's part of how we operate physiological as human beings. But in the event of PTSD or post-traumatic stress, those arousal symptoms become more prominent and can begin to interfere with how we're experiencing the world, may impact us emotionally, may impact us physically. So I mentioned it's very common in people who've experienced a trauma that's been where another human being may be the cause of it, whether that be physical or sexual assault, or things like combat, other types of violence, that they may exhibit a great deal of irritable or angry behavior. So they may be irritable, may have angry outbursts, particularly with little or no provocation. So often what you'll see is this irritability and or actual anger for something that from the outside might be viewed as something that's very slight. So it appears to be very out of proportion to what's occurred. And what we might think other people might react to. Arousal symptoms may also result in reckless or self-destructive behavior. So it's not uncommon. In fact, it's quite common in people who've been traumatized. Part of what they experience is putting themselves in similar situations to the trauma that they've been in. And that may occur through reckless or self-destructive behavior. Part of that, at the most basic, may be substance abuse and misuse. So using substances to the point where it's causing physical or psychological problems, engaging in repeated DUIs, linked with that irritability and anger, getting themselves in fights and confrontations with individuals or groups of individuals that may be very unsafe for them. So there are a number of ways that happens. Unfortunately, many people who've been sexually assaulted have a tendency to be, it's common that people who've experienced sexual assault experience more than one over their lifetime. For me, kind of the three very characteristic arousal symptoms of PTSD are hypervigilance. And hypervigilance is really a being excessively on guard for danger. So it's the idea that, or it's the situation where someone thinks that something's bad going to happen, whether they're consciously thinking about that or not. And so part of it becomes the next piece, which is an exaggerated startle response. So hypervigilance is being excessively on guard for dangers, seeing things and viewing them as potential dangers that aren't there. Whereas an exaggerated startle response is responding to some sensory perception in a way that's out of proportion. So probably, one of the things that is one of the common ways we talk about this is a combat veteran, for instance, diving for cover when they hear a loud sound or an explosion. People who've experienced assault, whether physical or sexual, may jump if someone comes up behind them, or they see something move in a darkened alley, those sorts of things. And then arousal symptoms also have to do with problems with concentration, an inability to remember. We've talked about amnestic aspects of the trauma, but also it may result in inability concentrating and remembering things that have nothing to do with the traumatic event. So it may impact the way we work, things that we do at home. We may forget things, burning things on the oven or in the stove, or forgetting appointments, forgetting to pick up your children. Those are kind of extreme examples, but it also may look like ADD or ADHD, with just kind of difficulty getting tasks done. Okay. All right, so the last piece of the diagnostic process for PTSD, and again, I want to keep underlining this. I'll probably do it for the next 2 hours. There's a range of reactions to traumatic events, and those are what we're talking about. PTSD is a extreme aspect. Only 7 to 8% of the population experiences PTSD, though that is much higher if you look at people who've been traumatized, and that varies based on the traumas that are experienced. But the diagnostic process to be diagnosed with PTSD as a mental disorder requires significant clinically significant distress or impairment. So having those symptoms that we just talked about is one piece of it. So that's a traumatic stress reaction or response, and experiencing traumatic stress. To be diagnosed with PTSD, those symptoms must also create distress for us. We recognize, or others may recognize, that it's causing significant distress for us in some form or another, and particularly with the impaired functioning in social aspects, or occupational aspects, educational aspects. So you can see how some of the symptoms are really tied into those. The social withdrawal we talked about, the irritability and anger, we're talking to other people, can really impact how we can whether individuals who traumatized can have close personal relationships, and may impact how they interact with their children and their family, and it certainly may impact the way they operate occupationally and educationally. So it impairs their ability to really operate in the world in a normal sense and get things done. And that's where we get to the point of post-traumatic stress disorder as opposed to traumatic stress. Probably I think we're break time. Let's do that before I go into the next stuff. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Dr. Bride. So we will take a 5-minute break, and please rejoin us in 5 minutes. We look forward to it. Thank you.
Okay, everyone, welcome back. And I wanted to introduce myself before I reintroduce Dr. Bride. My name is Grace Bagwell Adams, and I am on faculty in the College of Public Health at the University of Georgia, and am also the Assistant Dean for Outreach, Engagement, and Equity. And as the Principal Investigator of the Athens Wellbeing Project, I'm honored to be a co-host of this event today. This event is brought to you from some funding support from Resilient Georgia in partnership with the Patelik Foundation. And so we're very grateful for that support. And as Aaron Berger mentioned in the introduction, this is really the first of what we hope to be several trainings and professional development opportunities around the topics of trauma and resilience for our community and surrounding counties. I want to reintroduce Dr. Bride now and just read a little bit about his bio for those of you who might be just now joining us or missed that at the very beginning this morning. Dr. Brian Bride is professor and director of the School of Social Work at Georgia State University. His research and teaching interests are in the areas of behavioral health care, primary and secondary traumatic stress, health services research, HIV and AIDS, and workforce well-being. Dr. Bride is the developer of the secondary traumatic stress scale and has received a number of honors as a result of his research on secondary traumatic stress, including the Creative Research Medal from the University of Georgia. And in addition to that, he was named a distinguished scholar by the Center for Social Research at the University of Buffalo. Dr. Bride currently serves as editor-in-chief of Traumatology, an international journal published by the American Psychological Association. He received his MSW from Florida State University, his MPH from Harvard School of Public Health, and his PhD from the University of Georgia. So thank you so much, Dr. Bride, for leading us through this training today, and we look forward to the next section. Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you, Grace. And thank you all for coming back. Hopefully, let's see. Yeah, it looks like the number didn't go down, so that's good. All right, so these webinars are, though we're doing them more and more in the world, are still a little bit challenged in terms of timing. So I'm ahead of schedule a little bit. So just wanted to point that out. But I think this is a good, Jacob, if you can advance, a good place to restart. Grace had just mentioned Resilient Georgia. And kind of this next section, that's a big part of what I really want to talk about is the notion of resiliency. So in the last section, I talked pretty exclusively about the negative aspects of trauma and the negative aspects of traumatic stress. And as I will say multiple times throughout the day, that is really an important aspect. I want to, but at the same time, it's really also important to note the positive aspects of trauma. Don't get me wrong, not that people should seek out traumatic experiences for some of the positive aspects, but to keep in mind that people who experience trauma and experience the negative reactions of trauma, so we're not talking solely of people who experience trauma and not have negative reactions, can also come out of the traumatic experience in a positive way, or at least respond to the trauma in a way that that reduces the negative impact. So part of that, this is the notion of resiliency. And there are probably 3,000 definitions of resiliency. Here's two of them that I like best. So resiliency is the ability to thrive despite stress and adversity. And a second one is the capacity to prepare for, recover from, and adapt to stress, adversity, trauma, or tragedy. So resilience is that process of adapting well in the face of traumatic experiences, tragedy, threats, any significant source of stress. So it also extends beyond traumatized individuals. So people who experience extreme stress can experience resiliency as well. So it's, you know, experiencing trauma and stress and being able to bounce back from those difficult experiences, essentially. Um, Resiliency, I think it's important to note, is ordinary. It's not extraordinary. So people commonly demonstrate resilience. It's not the idea that there's a few people, a small proportion of people who experience trauma bounce back. That's really the norm. Um, but it's also important to note that both resilience and the negative stress reactions can occur at the same time if you're looking at just a snapshot. So resiliency can be seen as it's not that the person doesn't experience difficulty or stress. Emotional pain and sadness are common in people who've suffered major adversity or trauma. But the road to resilience is likely to involve considerable emotional distress. It's a process, it's a journey. Resilience is not just a trait that people have or don't have. It involves behaviors, thoughts, and actions that can be learned and developed. Though there are certain things that may be in place for us at the time of a traumatic event that may increase our resiliency ability. But some of those are things that we can also put in place. So part of resilience is having protective factors that are either in place or that can be developed. There's been a lot of research on the notion of resiliency over the past few decades, actually. And some of the original work on resiliency, because I think it's important to realize this, it's really been a shift in paradigm as we look at the way we look at individuals in adverse situations. So there was a study done in the 50s in Hawaii with a large population of children who had experienced adverse family situations or other adverse events. And the researchers, their point in doing the research was to document how those individuals were negatively affected throughout their life. And certainly they found out that there were some of those children that ended up having problems throughout their life. But they were surprised at that time to find that the majority of these children who were in some very distressing and very adverse situations actually did just fine in life. Some of them really thrived, some of them were really successful. Many of them struggled at different points in their life, but ultimately 30 years later, most of them were in very decent, good situations and no longer facing adversity. So this began to really get us to think about adverse experiences, and particularly traumatic events, as not necessarily being it's not that they have to cause negative outcomes. And even if there are some negative outcomes, those outcomes can be overcome over a period of time. So there are different ways that we can look at some of these factors that contribute to resiliency. And we tend to look, there's a number of ways to look at them. I like to look at individual, social, and community and cultural factors. Individual factors are individual traits or things, aspects of the way individuals interact with people in the world and their emotions in a way that supports them having a better outcome. So some of these factors are things like social ability, the ability to form healthy relationships with individuals rather than being kind of a loner or not having friendships. Having optimism, viewing self in the future positively despite any of the adverse events that may have occurred. Being flexible, so change is part of life, and flexibility is a protective factor. Conversely, rigidity in many aspects becomes a risk factor. Individuals who have a good deal of self-confidence or competence, we can look at it both ways, self-confidence or competence, moving toward, they're good at moving towards goals, base their decisions on their confidence in their own abilities. They have competence, they're good at something and take pride in it. These are all aspects, personality aspects that are related to an individual's resiliency. Having insight, being insightful, understanding people and situations, being able to see the other side of events, of situations. So to a certain degree, having not just insightfulness, but empathy to see the other perspective. Perseverance. Individuals who are resilient persevere, they don't give up, they're persistent, and they often see that as a quality within themselves. They have a certain perspective. So people who have resilient often view crises as challenges to be faced, not that they're insurmountable obstacles, not that they, they don't give up and say things are horrible, I can't overcome it. But they have this perspective of being challenged and I'm going to beat this, I'm going to get through this. Self-control is another individual factor related to resilience. The ability to manage strong feelings and impulses, having an internal locus of control, so feeling that they are part of the reason why they can manage those strong feelings and impulses, that their actions are within their own control, that their outcomes are within their own control. This would be a good place to point out how some of these things interact with the symptoms of traumatic stress. So if self-control has to do with managing strong feelings and impulses, and many of the symptoms we talked about has to do with feeling or having strong negative feelings, and having impulsive behaviors, having anger. So you can see how the ability to have self-control, that trait or that ability can help counteract some of the stuff that occurs within traumatic stress. So there are some biological factors like temperament, emotional intelligence, creativity, and some genetic and physical characteristics that are associated with resilience. And I mentioned control. So the capacity to manipulate one's environment, mastery, social competence, self-esteem, and having a sense of personal autonomy and a sense of purpose are all factors that contribute to an individual's resiliency. In terms of social factors, these are factors that concern the social relationships one has and whether an individual can call on and expect support in time of crisis. So social factors may include things like family, friends, coworkers, or really anyone in an individual's social network who could provide social, emotional, or even tangible sort of financial support to the individual. So having a social network to fall back on, to have people who will step up and help in those different domains, emotionally, physically, socially, financially, to help you out, help the individual out in the aftermath of an adverse or traumatic event, is a positive predictive factor. Having those relationships can be an important determinant of whether an individual can cope with the major stressors beyond trauma, such as the loss of a job, a divorce, or chronic physical illness, but certainly also impacts recovery from traumatic experiences. And I do want to highlight that social support involves both emotional support, so listening to and processing, having empathy, and just demonstrating emotional support through words and through actions and through availability is part of these social factors that are protective. And also instrumental support, which is providing tangible assistance aimed at solving a problem. So doing something specifically so having someone who specifically engages with us is is part of the protective factor. I should also note that the social support that's important, we often think of family as the first line of social support for us. Unfortunately, as many of you know, not all of us have families that are supportive, and sometimes in the case of trauma, it's the family that's causing some of the traumatic stress or causing the traumatic events that occur. What the resilience research has shown is really that one of the key factors to people overcoming and even thriving in the face of adverse and traumatic events is having a single person who they can count on to provide these emotional and instrumental supports. Doesn't have to be a family member. It doesn't have to be a friend. Often it can be a community member. It may be a pastor, a youth worker. It may be, my friend's grandmother down the street. There are a lot of ways, but it's having a solid individual that is really there for you emotionally and instrumentally. And certainly having more than one individual increases the protective factor for social factors. And when we start talking about secondary trauma, I'm going to talk about social support, social factors a lot as well. There are also community and cultural factors that are associated with resilience. So having access to support services, behavioral health services, instrumental housing, food, whatever support services might be necessary given the outcome or the traumatic event that occurred. Community networking, so having a community or being engaged in a community where people interact and there's opportunity to meet new people and make new relationships and interact in various ways. And I do want to point out that community certainly means what we traditionally think of as community, the neighborhood, the block, the people who are around us. But certainly in these, I think we've definitely seen through the last couple of months with COVID that community can be from a distance, can be electronic. So community can mean a lot of different things. What it is having a collective group of people who can provide support in various ways. Having an attachment to some community is a protective factor. So not just that there's a community there, but the individual has an attachment, identifies as part of a community, and that typically involves participation in the community group, participation in the things that the community does. And often there can be community and cultural norms against violence that may help with resilience. The last piece of community and cultural is having a strong community or cultural or ethnic identity or pride is also a protective factor. So similar to resiliency, but slightly different, is the notion of post-traumatic growth. So post-traumatic growth is positive change experienced as a result of the struggle with a major life crisis or a traumatic event. So sometimes people, for instance, post-traumatic growth happens in a number of different ways. So we tend to think of 5 general areas that post-traumatic growth occurs in. So sometimes people who must face major life crises develop a sense that new opportunities have emerged from the struggle, opening up possibilities that were not present before. So post-traumatic growth has to do with people seeing their negative experiences, seeing the traumatic event, though there's negativity associated with it, but it also provides an opportunity to engage and develop in ways that the individual had not necessarily identified before. A second area of post-traumatic growth is a change in relationships with others. Some people experience closer relationships with perhaps some specific people in their lives in the aftermath of a trauma and adverse incidences. And they can also experience an increased sense of connection to others who have suffered similar experiences. So part of post-traumatic growth is this kind of developing closer, more important relationships interpersonally with others. A third aspect of post-traumatic growth is an increased sense of one's own strength. If I lived through that, I can face anything. So that sometimes the outcome of an adverse experience or traumatic event is a sense of strength. It can't get any worse than that. That was the worst thing I've experienced, and I made it through that, so I can do anything. And so a lot of people who experience resiliency and post-traumatic growth have this aspect that results from the traumatic event. A fourth aspect of post-traumatic growth is a greater appreciation for life in general. So coming out of it thinking, thank God I'm alive, and I'm going to live life to its fullest. I'm going to make something of myself. I'm going to help other people. I'm going to be there for other people. So there's a number of ways that that appreciation of life in general can really manifest itself. And then the fifth aspect of post-traumatic growth involves the spiritual religious domain. So some individuals experience a deepening of their spiritual lives or faith. And also for others, it may be a deepening. This deepening can also involve a significant change in one's belief system. So we've talked some about that within the symptoms of post-traumatic stress, that there's cognitive and worldview changes that occur. That's in the negative sense. They can also occur in the positive sense through post-traumatic growth. Okay. All right. So part of what we said, what I said I would talk about is trauma-informed care. I think it's kind of important this slide helps us kind of underline why that's important. Why do we need to be trauma-informed as professionals, or frankly, simply as community members? Well, the need for trauma-informed professionals has to do with, well, let me stop first. What is a trauma-informed professional? So by trauma-informed professional, I mean a professional who has an understanding of trauma and an awareness of the impact that it may have across settings, services, populations, and a trauma-informed professional conducts themselves in a way to be sensitive to the potential impact of trauma on the individuals that they're working with, and to prevent re-traumatization. So I have this slide titled as professionals, but being trauma-informed helps outside of professional situations as well. But trauma-informed professionals are needed in order to provide effective services. We need to understand the life situations that may be contributing to individuals' current problems. So keeping in mind that past traumatic experiences may manifest in people's behavior and problems down the road. Part of this is not blaming individuals for their situation and their problems. Many current problems faced by the people we serve at any capacity may be related to those traumatic life experiences. So knowing that is an important aspect of being trauma-informed. People who have experienced traumatic life events are often very sensitive to situations that remind them of the people, places, or things involved in their traumatic event. So understanding how people can negatively respond to a traumatic event and going back to those re-experiencing symptoms and those avoidance symptoms, how those play out with individuals in different contexts can help us understand why they're behaving in certain ways, but it also helps us understand how our behaviors and how how we engage with individuals may impact them if they've been traumatized. So, we need to understand things like, so people who've been traumatized, particularly physically or sexually assaulted, often do not want to be touched. So being aware of that can be really help to avoid re-traumatization of individuals. Triggers, maybe people have triggers. And by trigger, I mean those sights, sounds, smells, people, places, things, and feelings that are associated for the individual with those prior traumatic experiences, those physiological and psychological cues I talked about earlier. So triggers may bring back memories of the trauma and result in emotional and physical reactions. So these triggers that people bring with them, so everyone has kind of their own, who's been traumatized, has specific triggers related to their traumas that we can't necessarily know on the outside. They may cause a person to relive the trauma and view our setting or organization, the services we are providing as a source of distress rather than a place of healing and wellness. All right, so we like to keep things a little simple sometimes. So there's this notion of the 4 R's of being trauma informed. The first is realize. To be trauma informed means you realize the widespread impact of trauma and understand the potential path for recovery. And again, I've said it 5 times, I'll say it 12 more, maybe 30, that trauma often results in negative outcomes, but it's not predestined to do so. People experience symptoms, and particularly as we talk about resilience and post-traumatic growth, come out of those. Post-traumatic growth and resiliency do not mean the absence of experiencing negative effects of traumatic events. So you can both experience traumatic stress, but your resiliency may help lead you to post-traumatic growth, but certainly help you overcome those. So it's a process. The second R is recognizing the signs and symptoms of traumas in clients, families, and staff. And I mentioned staff, and because of the fact that many of you are within organizations, nonprofit organizations, behavioral health settings, schools, all sorts of different organizations, that trauma impacts the clients, the family of clients, the people around the clients, but also the people around us in the professional setting. So just as many of our clients have experienced trauma, many of the people that we work with have experienced trauma as well. And it's helpful as a trauma-informed organization to recognize that. The third R is respond by fully integrating knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices. So it's not enough just to realize and recognize trauma, but that we respond on an individual and organizational way that utilizes that knowledge about trauma in the way we have policies and procedures and how we engage and how our organizational engages with individuals. And really part of the end result of that is the 4th R, which is to resist re-traumatizing clients and staff who've experienced trauma. So taking steps to avoid doing that is a significant piece of being trauma informed. So let me talk a little bit more about that re-traumatization, because that's a very important aspect of being trauma informed. So by re-traumatization, I mean the individuals have experienced some trauma in their life, and it has an ongoing negative reaction to that, or even may have resolved some of that, but can be re-traumatized based on a second occurrence of it, or simply reminders and experiences that causes kind of a replay or re-experiencing of that traumatic event. So One way within, I'm trying to look at a broad range of different service organizations, but particularly coming from behavioral health and social services. Challenging or discounting reports of abuse or traumatic events is a way to re-traumatize other people. So really minimizing or denying that something happened. No way, that didn't happen, or you're overreacting is a way that we might re-traumatize individuals. And using isolation and physical restraints in certain settings can be re-traumatizing for individuals. Using experiential exercises that humiliate or involve shame for the individual. So a trauma-informed organization, trauma-informed professional is conscious of that and would avoid using those sorts of interventions. Endorsing a confrontational approach in counseling and in services can be re-traumatizing as well. And as I mentioned before, I worked for many years in substance abuse treatment centers. Confrontation is something that can be very helpful with people in different ways, but confrontation does not have to be done in a negative way that might cause re-traumatization. So confrontation is really just pointing out discrepancies for an individual between what they say they're doing and what they are doing. It does not have to be linked with anger, shame, putting the person down. It can be done in a humane and compassionate way. And so in those situations where some confrontation is necessary, you have to keep that in mind. In situations where clients may interact with others, allowing abusive behavior of one client toward another to continue without intervention is a way to re-traumatize clients. Labeling behaviors and feelings as pathological or bad or shameful is re-traumatizing. And failing to provide adequate security and safety within the program or organization for individuals who might be traumatized is a really important piece of resisting the ability to resisting re-traumatizing clients and staff. All right, so how can we prevent re-traumatization? So one strategy, the first strategy, is to be sensitive to the needs of clients or, let's just say individuals who have experienced trauma regarding behaviors in the treatment setting that might trigger memories of the trauma. So these strategies are coming from literature on trauma-informed service providers and organizations. The wording in this can certainly be adapted to just, preventing re-traumatization in the community and on one-on-one interactions with people in our personal lives as well. So keep in mind this, being sensitive to the needs of individuals who've experienced trauma regarding the behaviors in which they're interacting with yourself. That the things, our interactions with others may trigger memories of traumas and may trigger those negative feelings and physiological responses. So we have to be sensitive to that fact. The second strategy is to not ignore individual symptoms and demands when clients with trauma histories act out in response to triggered trauma memories. That doing so ignoring the trauma or ignoring their reaction, ignoring the negative aspects of that may actually replicate the original traumatic experience. So whereas it would be inappropriate to react negatively to someone's presentation of trauma, to not react is also a way to re-traumatize. So it's important to recognize and acknowledge the symptoms and behaviors of an individual who's experiencing trauma. Strategy 3 is to be mindful that efforts to control and contain a client's behavior in treatment can produce an abnormal reaction, particularly for trauma survivors for whom being trapped was part of the trauma experience. So in some organizations, that's, you know, part of the policies might include isolation and trying to really box in a person's emotional response. Part of being trauma informed is recognizing that those are normal reactions and providing support for the individual as they experience them. Strategy 4 is to listen for specific triggers that seem to be driving the client's reaction. So an important step in recovery from trauma is helping the individual identify these cues and thereby reach a better understanding of reactions and behaviors. So, you know, I want reiterating that part of the traumatic stress process is experiencing a traumatic event, and then that traumatic event being linked for the individual with extreme negative emotions and physiological responses. Part of the process of recovering from trauma for an individual is recognizing that stimulus response aspect, that when I see X or when I hear X, that's when I become angry or feel shame or disassociate or have heart palpitations. So part of helping in recovery for any individuals to help them look at that. If you identify those triggers and the connection that allows the individual to begin to break that connection between the trigger, the cue, and the negative reaction. All right, so key principles for being trauma informed. One, being trauma informed, a key principle is safety. So throughout an organization, the staff and the people they serve feel physically and psychologically, so physically and psychologically, you have to keep that in mind, safe. The physical setting is safe, and interpersonal interactions promote a sense of safety. So going back and linking to some of the things that we've talked about, for, you know, negative confrontation does not allow individuals to feel psychologically safe in interpersonal interactions. Being trauma informed also involves the principle of trustworthiness and transparency, so that organizational operations and decisions are conducted with transparency and with the goal of building and maintaining trust among clients, family members, staff, and others who are involved with the organization. And I'll underline again, being trauma informed can be both on an individual level. You can be trauma informed and interact in that way, but it also, particularly when we're talking about service provision, that occurs within some sort of organization or program, and that organization program can or cannot be trauma informed. So obviously, I would push for it to be trauma informed, but you as an individual can be trauma informed even if the organization may not be. Organizational operations and decisions, I mentioned, are conducted with transparency, with the goal of building and maintaining trust. So people who've been traumatized, often their sense of trust, that's part of how their worldview and their beliefs may change. So they may be very distrustful. It's really important to engage in that. So, you know, be transparent, to follow through with the services that have been promised, to follow through with, you know, telling a client that you're non-judgmental, and then not being judgmental is a part of being trustworthy. Another aspect of being trauma informed is collaboration and mutuality, so that there's true partnering and a leveling of power differences between staff and clients and among the organizational staff. We're talking from direct care staff all the way up to administrators. There's a recognition that healing happens in relationships and in the meaningful sharing of power and decision making. So not to say that there's not a hierarchy in organizations, but that we must be very reflective of that process and engage in behaviors within that hierarchy that transmit trustworthiness and transparency and mutuality and safety to both the clients we may be serving as well as the staff that and our co-workers and colleagues. Empowerment also throughout the organization. Empowerment is another trauma-informed principle. Throughout the organization and among the clients served, individuals' strengths are recognized, built on, and validated. New skills are developed as needed. So a trauma-informed organization builds into its policies and its organizational culture that strengths are important. We build upon strengths and we help provide opportunities for those strengths to grow. Voice and choice has to do with the organization aiming to strengthen the experience of choice for clients, family members, and staff. It recognizes that every person's experience is unique and requires an individual approach. I think you're probably beginning to see that these principles have some overlap amongst them. So voice and choice, you can't have voice and choice if you're not having empowerment. So if you don't empower your staff or your clients, it's hard for them to have voice and choice. Being trauma-informed also involves cultural, historical, and gender issues. So the organization who's trauma-informed incorporates policies, protocols, and processes that are responsive to racial, ethnic, and cultural needs of individuals served that are gender responsive, that incorporate a focus on historical trauma. So it's recognizing all of these things that we've talked about as potential issues for any given person within the organization or within the client population. Okay. All right, next. Okay. All right, so now we get into the impact of trauma on the persons and organizations that are providing service. So I mentioned before that within the diagnostic criteria for PTSD, things have changed from you must directly experience or witness the trauma to there can be some indirect exposure. And through professional interaction was what we identified as one of those possibilities. There's a range of things, negative impacts of working with people who've been traumatized that may come to us as providers or colleagues. And there have been a number of terms that have been thrown around to kind of talk about that, to kind of label that and identify what that is. And so that's part of what, or a big part of what we want to talk about here. So on this slide, you see the notions of secondary traumatic stress, vicarious traumatization, compassion fatigue, burnout, shared trauma, which I mentioned before, and moral distress. So I'm gonna over the next few slides, that's what we're going to talk specifically about. I'm going to provide some definitions and some examples of that. Then I want to talk about the risk and protective factors against the negative impact or secondary traumatic stress. And then again, congruent with when we're talking about direct trauma, that there's some positive aspects that can come out of this work as well. All right, so secondary traumatic stress. Secondary traumatic stress these are two definitions that have been out in the literature. Chuck Figley is one of the originators of this field. He's one of the first people who identified secondary traumatic stress as an issue back in the 90s. Actually, he identified it first in the 80s. And so these are both definitions that he's put forth. That secondary traumatic stress is the natural consequent behaviors and emotions resulting from knowledge about a stressful event experienced by a significant other. And that significant other could be family, friends, or certainly clients, as we've talked about before. He also has identified it as I put natural, highlighted that in red and italics because as with primary trauma, it is important, very, very important from my perspective, that we recognize that experiencing secondary traumatic stress or negative aspects of work with traumatized individuals is normal. That's normal. Where it becomes a problem is when it begins to, just as with PTSD, when the symptoms and the experiences begin to interfere significantly with how we interact with the world, or how we interact with our family, our friends, and our occupation. So having some secondary traumatic stress throughout your career, particularly at the beginning of the career, is normal. It should not be seen as a signal that you're not cut out for working with this population. So it's a natural consequence. I would say that part of a way to look at it is that secondary traumatic stress is an occupational hazard of working with traumatized individuals, but that those hazards and the impact that they have can be minimized and limited. And that's part of what we'll be talking about down the road a little bit. So Figley also defines secondary traumatic stress as a syndrome of symptoms nearly identical to PTSD, except that exposure to a traumatizing event experienced by one person becomes a traumatizing event for the second person. So again, I have a couple pieces highlighted here. Nearly, I've crossed that out because as we've mentioned before, indirect trauma is now recognized as a potential exposure criterion for PTSD. So secondary traumatic stress is post-traumatic stress. It just highlights that it's an indirect transmission of the trauma to the individuals, and allows us to focus on the population of professionals and individuals who've been indirectly traumatized. I also have that, so Figley used to talk about secondary traumatic stress disorder when he first started writing about this. And I think he would say the same thing. It's important to kind of not focus simply on the most extreme. So certainly secondary traumatic stress, because it is post-traumatic stress, can result in a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. But there's a wide range of symptoms, a wide range of intensity of symptoms, a wide range of frequency of symptoms, not all of which would result in a diagnosis. Okay, so let me underline then that secondary traumatic stress is post-traumatic stress. When we talked earlier, all those symptoms I talked about, the intrusion and re-experiencing symptoms, the avoidance symptoms, the negative cognitions of mood, the arousal symptoms, all of those play out in secondary traumatic stress. The difference is that you haven't been directly traumatized. The triggers, the cues, the thoughts, the reminders are about the traumas that another individual, a client or a friend, has faced. Okay. All right, we can go to the next one. Another term that's used a lot is compassion fatigue. Charles Figley also introduced this term, and he introduced it and said it is exactly the same as secondary traumatic stress. So secondary traumatic stress and compassion fatigue, from the original use of it from Figley, is the exact same thing. They're synonymous. The reason that he's using two terms was, as I said, he initially talked about secondary traumatic stress disorder a lot, and he was concerned that professionals would be reluctant to identify their own experience of secondary traumatic stress because using disorder was too pathologizing. So really, compassion fatigue became a kind of a warmer, fuzzier way to label secondary traumatic stress, with the idea that professionals would be more willing to identify that experience and be more willing to own that and be able to recognize that. So it was introduced as a potentially less stigmatizing term. I tend to use secondary traumatic stress as a term because compassion fatigue is used in many different ways, and I still I identify with the initial, that compassion fatigue is secondary traumatic stress. Some have used compassion fatigue to refer to kind of the combined effect of secondary traumatic stress and burnout. I'm going to talk about burnout in a few minutes. But burnout and secondary trauma are distinct concepts. They can occur together, but they are not the same thing. And so compassion fatigue as an umbrella for those just muddies the water a little bit. All right, so another term that's been used is vicarious trauma or vicarious traumatization. So vicarious traumatization is a term that was introduced by Lori Perlman and Karen Sakvintny in the early 90s, and they were writing about vicarious traumatization really at the same time Charles Figley was starting to write about secondary traumatic stress. And so it really emerged in a parallel process with Figley's work on secondary traumatic stress. Perlman was a psychologist who had a group practice that focused primarily on sexual assault survivors, either adult survivors or adults who were assaulted as children or even children. And what they began to recognize as they worked together and shared their experiences was that they were changing as a result of the work that they were doing with people who've been traumatized. And so they came up with this term vicarious traumatization to identify that change, that transformation. The transformation, as she says, in the inner experience of the therapist that comes about as a result of empathic engagement with traumatic material. And that transformation includes profound disruptions in the therapist's frame of reference, his or her basic sense of identity, worldview, and spirituality. But these are still anchored in the transmission of trauma from one individual to the therapist. So these are direct outcomes of trauma. Okay. So when she talks about vicarious traumatization, she talks about particularly frame of reference and psychological needs are the two domains where there's significant disruptions and changes. Frame of reference should be a little familiar from some of the things that I've talked about in terms of going back to Ronnie Gianna-Fullman and shattered assumptions and changes in cognition and mood, that as a professional working with traumatized populations, over time, my identity may change. I may question my identity as a service provider, whether I'm good enough for the work, whether I should be doing the work, whether I'm helping. I may change how I view the world in terms of its safety, in terms of the psychological needs that we'll talk about as well. And I change in terms of spirituality. And by spirituality, Perlman really means broadly a connection to something larger than us and a sense of meaning and connection. So it's not necessarily religious based, but it certainly incorporates that as well. And so our frame of reference may change. Our worldview may change. We don't see the world as safe. We see the world as unjust. We may question our relationship to a higher power. We may, as you saw some of the symptoms of PTSD, our connection to others, to God, to community, to family, connection and meaning and meaningfulness may change in a negative way as well. She also talks about how vicarious traumatization, the process of working with traumatized individuals, may change what she sees as 5 important psychological needs that we all have. And that first being safety. So if we're working with individuals who've been traumatized, we're hearing these stories of their their experiences, it causes us to question our own safety, as well as others' safety. So she also breaks psychological needs down into self and others. So through the process of working with traumatized individuals, for instance, we may begin to feel less safe. I think of the example of someone who works with sexual assault survivors, with rape survivors, who then does not feel safe walk into their car anymore, or in certain situations. Again, as I mentioned with with some of the traumatic stress stuff, some of that is a functional, is a smart adaptation and reaction. It becomes problematic when it begins to interfere. So the process of vicarious traumatization causes us to have changes, disrupted trust in ourselves. So that may be trust as ourselves as a person and as a professional. It may change how we trust others, in terms of, trusting what people say, what they will do. We may view people much more or much less trustworthy than we had in the past. It affects esteem, both self-esteem and other esteem, how we see ourselves. So it may change our how we see ourselves whether we see ourselves as an effective or competent professional. And it certainly affects the esteem that we hold others in. So if we've seen how, particularly in the case of perpetrated traumas, how horrible some people may be, it's hard for us to hold others in high esteem as well. So, and going on, vicarious traumatization impacts our sense of intimacy and our sense of control over our lives and the lives of others. What I think is important to say is that vicarious traumatization and secondary traumatic stress are talking about the same phenomena. All these are kind of two sides of the same coin for secondary traumatic stress. And indeed, over time, some of this work with vicarious traumatization has worked itself into the diagnostic criteria for PTSD. So some of that should seem familiar, particularly around the notion of changed cognitions and mood, and the social isolation aspects and those sorts of things. So vicarious traumatization and secondary traumatization are the same thing. They came about at the same time from kind of different theoretical perspectives, but they're really also interchangeable terms. Okay. All right. I'm sure all of you have heard the term burnout. Burnout is defined as a prolonged response to chronic emotional and interpersonal stressors on the job, determined by the dimensions of exhaustion, cynicism, and inefficacy. And certainly work with or being engaged with individuals who've been traumatized can result in burnout. But it's not the same thing as secondary traumatic stress. Burnout is really the core we see is this sense of emotional exhaustion that occurs. One of the pieces that differentiates burnout and secondary traumatic stress is, by definition, secondary traumatic stress is a result of working with traumatized populations. It's about that, as Perlman said, it's about that empathic engagement as the transmission of trauma from one individual to another. Burnout, though certainly working with populations that may be challenging, can increase levels of burnout. Burnout is largely seen as an organizational issue. Burnout is a response to excessive job demands in excess of resources on the job. So part of it certainly is the emotional engagement with individuals, but it also has to do with organizational culture, and not having enough resources, not feeling like they have enough time, not feeling like you have support. So going back to be a trauma-informed organization can help with clients in secondary traumatic stress, but also burnout. Another difference is that secondary traumatic burnout does not require exposure to traumatic clients or populations. So burnout can happen really in any context. But that being said, I said before, both burnout and secondary trauma co-occur quite commonly. It's not the same thing, but they can occur together. But I think it's really, so some people have said in the past that secondary traumatic stress is just burnout repackaged. But we have a number of studies that clearly differentiates those at this point. Shared trauma, I mentioned before. So shared trauma is the affective, behavioral, cognitive, spiritual, and multimodal responses that clinicians experience as a result of dual exposure to the same collective trauma as their clients. So what shared trauma really is as an individual, as a professional or individual, I've experienced, there's a trauma that's experienced the community. It's a collective trauma, can be disaster, and maybe war. Much of the research and literature on shared trauma came out of Israel and living in a state of terrorism and post 9/11, where therapists and social service providers were helping people work on the trauma of 9/11, but yet they also were there. In Manhattan and experienced it and had friends and family that died as well. So shared trauma is the notion of both working with someone who's experienced trauma, but also having experienced that trauma themselves. And I think you can probably see how shared trauma might be quite complex. As a provider, I may be having those negative experiences of trauma, but as a professional, I also need to be able to separate ideally my negative experiences from what I'm doing to help that individual and try to put that aside. But obviously in such a complex situation, that becomes much more difficult. So it's important to recognize that in some cases, the negative aspects of secondary trauma may be intensified due to in situations where we have collective trauma and therefore shared trauma. Okay. And I also want to introduce a notion of moral distress. I think this is something, whether it's been named or not, I think it's something that has become apparent in our current situation with COVID, with healthcare providers particularly. So moral distress is the experience that follows when one feels constrained from acting according to what one believes to be ethically correct, and refers to the organizational setting and its policies and practice that may conflict with the practitioner's own beliefs and values. So moral distress occurs when we, through our professional activities or organizations or healthcare facilities, have to make decisions or perform procedures or engage in certain interventions that we would not necessarily, that we don't feel comfortable with on a moral or ethical level. But because of the situation that we're in, because of organizational policies, we might have to do this. So I think within our current environment, certainly there's the risk of moral distress when, as the conversation was around potential rationing of care, rationing of life-saving equipment in light of COVID. So there's certainly, I want to recognize that a lot of healthcare providers may have been experiencing moral distress to a certain extent. Moral distress is not secondary traumatic stress, but moral distress, like burnout, can co-occur with secondary traumatic stress and may actually increase the possibility of negative outcomes and secondary traumatic stress. Okay. So break time. It's break time. Go get your coffee. Go get some water. Grace.
Okay, yes, it is officially break time, and this break is going to be 10 minutes long, so we'll resume at 10:50, but I did want to just take a minute to say something really important. We want to acknowledge that today's training might be very challenging for some of us. especially those who have experienced trauma or know loved ones who have. So we want to encourage you to please let us know if you need help connecting in accessing supportive services as you receive this content. Please just send us an email. We're here to inform and also acknowledge the difficult nature of this topic. So we just want you all to know that we're in this together. And with that, we will go into the break, and we'll see you again at 10:50. Thanks very much.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jacob Lambeck. I'm a recent graduate of the University of Georgia's Master of Public Administration program, and I'm working in partnership with the Athens Area Community Foundation, Athens Wellbeing Project, and Envision Athens to provide support for this grant and these trainings. Welcome back to Trauma 101, Caring for Yourself and Others from a Trauma-Informed Perspective, being conducted by Dr. Brian Bride. If you haven't heard about Dr. Brian Bride, he is a professor and director of the School of Social Work at Georgia State University. He also currently serves as the editor-in-chief of Traumatology, an international journal. He's the developer of the Secondary Traumatic Stress Scale and has received a number of honors as a result of his research on secondary traumatic stress. Dr. Bride's work has appeared in leading journals such as Social Work Research, Research on Social Work Practice, Health and Social Work, Substance Use and Misuse, and Drug and Alcohol Dependence. He had an article that was identified in the British Journal of Social Work as the sixth most influential piece of social work in the last decade. We're entering our last half hour of the training, so I want to thank you for your attentiveness and interest in trauma-informed care. The turnout for this event has been greater than we ever could have expected, and it's very reassuring to see people from all over the world in attendance, from Athens, Georgia, to Athens, Ohio, to Athens, Greece. We had attendees from every continent except Antarctica. We're still working on that one, so we're glad you could join us today. We would also like to again thank Resilient Georgia and the Potomac Foundation. Without their co-sponsored grant, this and any future events like it would not have been possible. So with that, Dr. Bride, I will turn the floor back over to you.
All right, there we go. Sorry about that. I was muted for a moment. Okay, so this slide is really just about me wanting to talk about the impact of secondary traumatic stress on organizations. And that secondary traumatic stress, higher levels of secondary traumatic stress can result in turnover of staff and volunteers, absenteeism, but certainly something a little bit different, which is called presenteeism, which is showing up but not being fully engaged in the work that is needed to be done. Secondary trauma can impact the quality of services, clinical decision-making, ethical decision-making, etc. So I highlight this to kind of just stress the idea that secondary trauma is not something that just simply impacts the individual professional or paraprofessional or individual, but can also have an impact on the larger place within which they work. Okay. So I'm not going to bore you with all the numbers. There's been a number of studies looking at the prevalence of secondary traumatic stress amongst various different populations of professionals and volunteers and paraprofessionals and so forth, foster care parents, all sorts, educators, nurses, all sorts of things. The summary of that is that most service providers who interact and have responsibility for traumatized populations, most providers experience some symptoms of secondary traumatic stress. At the same time, most have fairly low levels of secondary traumatic stress. So I want to, again, go back to secondary traumatic stress symptoms are a normal reaction to some of the work that's done. It's a problem when it becomes like with PTSD, when it has that level of clinical distress or impairment in how we work, how we interact with our family and friends, and so on. And a lot of what we're going to talk about for the remaining time is how to address that the experience of secondary traumatic stress so that it doesn't get to that point of clinically significant distress or impairment. Okay, so first I want to talk about oh, I'm sorry. And then the last piece on that is, yes, so most experience low levels of secondary traumatic stress, but in some populations, there certainly is a significant amount of service providers who have relatively high levels of secondary traumatic stress. For instance, in one study I conducted, 30% of child protective service workers could possibly meet the criteria for PTSD due to secondary traumatic stress at the time that they were interviewed. Much higher than the rate of 7 to 8% of PTSD in the general population. All right, so let's talk about, I'm going to talk about risk factors and protective factors, and then self-care and what you can do to address this. Kind of by definition, exposure to traumatized populations is a risk factor for secondary traumatic stress. But I think it's important to note that exposure comes in a variety of ways. So it may be in terms of the number of people we work with who are traumatized. It may have to do with the proportion of people that we work with who are traumatized. It may have to do with the amount of time that we're engaging in services or care or with people who are traumatized. How much time so really exposure has to do with frequency and amount. And so if you're in a position where more of your time is used in thinking about or processing or investigating trauma, you have a much higher level of exposure. The other piece of exposure to note that I failed to talk about with PTSD is that what we know from research for primary trauma, there's different types of trauma different traumatic events have different rates of resulting in post-traumatic stress disorder, put it that way. So certain traumas are higher risk for PTSD, particularly sexual assault or sexual abuse and combat-like situations. So those two are the types of traumas that are most likely to result in PTSD amongst people who directly experience them or witness them. And that then also extends to those people who are indirectly exposed to those traumas. Those tend to be traumas that are more likely to result in secondary traumatic stress. In terms of demographics, we've looked at a number of demographic factors that might be associated with secondary traumatic stress. Two that come up fairly regularly or consistently are age and length of professional experience in the same direction though. So for older individuals and people who have more experience have lower levels of secondary traumatic stress. Put more into risk factor terms, people with less experience with traumatized populations and people with less, who are younger, have higher rates of secondary trauma and more intense traumatization. What we're seeing is the first 2 to 3 years, particularly the first year to two, of work with traumatized populations are the riskiest. But over time, many people develop the coping mechanisms and the support things that we're going to talk about in terms of protective factors that help. That's not to say that older and very experienced professionals don't experience secondary traumatic stress. They do as well. There's been some research to indicate that women are more at risk for secondary traumatic stress, but I think that has to do with that's confounded by two things. One being that in most studies of secondary traumatic stress, they're done in professions that are heavily female dominated. So there are much fewer men in the samples, and so there's less possibility for it showing up. The other piece is going back to that exposure, is that women are much more likely to work with sexual assault survivors. In fact, men are rarely involved in those positions. And if sexual assault and child sexual assault and sexual abuse are more likely to result in PTSD. They're also more likely to result in secondary traumatic stress. So there's a disproportion in the types of traumas that female professionals deal with in certain fields than males do. So what we do know from research on primary traumatic stress, which originally showed that women were more likely to develop PTSD in the aftermath of trauma, is that when you control for things like the severity and type of trauma, that gender difference goes away. So that's a long way of saying I don't think women are necessarily more at risk. They're just more exposed. Trauma history is something that we've always talked about in terms of a risk factor for secondary traumatic stress. And by that, I mean the professionals, the individual's own history of trauma. And can include shared trauma, but also just means past trauma that the individual experienced that the client doesn't share. So if I have my own history of being physically abused or being sexually assaulted, does that put me at higher risk for experiencing secondary traumatic stress in my professional life? So there's been mixed research on this, but what it really comes down to at this point is it's not whether someone has a history of trauma in their background that's a risk factor. It's whether the individual continues to have negative reactions to that trauma. So if someone's still carrying around secondary traumatic stress reactions to their own trauma, they're more likely to have secondary traumatic stress symptoms. Those who've had traumas in the past but have resolved the negative aspects of that trauma actually are protected. They have lower rates of secondary traumatic stress and lower intensity of secondary traumatic stress, presumably because in working through their own traumas, they've developed their own coping mechanisms that can also be applied to the secondary trauma. Burnout is actually a risk factor for secondary traumatic stress. I mentioned that they co-occur a lot. And so there's been a couple studies that have looked at whether burnout precedes secondary traumatic stress or secondary traumatic stress precedes burnout. And it turns out secondary traumatic stress does not increase the risk of burnout. However, burnout does increase the risk of secondary traumatic stress. So going back to the notion, what we talked about with organizations, burnout has to do a lot with organizational culture and organizational responsibilities. Organizational culture and policies and procedures can help reduce burnout, which can then help reduce secondary traumatic stress. Okay. And then empathy is a risk factor. So I mentioned earlier that empathic engagement, so being empathic with clients and their particularly around their traumatic events, is what places us at risk. It's part of the exposure to the trauma. It's part of what conveys the negative aspects of the trauma. So if you think about what empathy is, most people will say that empathy is taking another person's perspective, putting yourself in the other person's shoes, as well as has an aspect of emotional or affective sharing. So we put ourselves in their shoes and we try to, we feel what they were feeling as a means to be empathic. And indeed, that aspect of empathy does put us at risk. There's some evidence that the more empathic we are in terms of those two aspects, perspective taking and affective sharing, are risk factors. The good news is, next slide, is empathy is also a protective factor. Actually, Jacob, go one more. Okay. And then we're going to go back again in a minute. So there's most people think of empathy as the way I just described it. But there's been a lot of research into the notion of empathy, the construct of empathy. And Destiny and Jackson have this 4-factor model of empathy. I already mentioned perspective taking and affective sharing. So the capacity to take the perspective of another and the ability to have automatic or unconscious have affective responses to others, that is part of that perspective taking, is a core feature of empathy. That's how the empathy is transmitted, how that empathy is engaged. And I mentioned that those are risk factors, and I by no means want to imply that we should not be empathic with the people that we engage with. In fact, empathy is really necessary to have effective services. Luckily, there's, from Destiny and Jackson's point of view, there's two other aspects of the empathic engagement process. One of those is self-other awareness. So the ability to temporarily identify between self and others that ultimately avoids confusion between self and other. So that is that we have the perspective taken, we put ourselves in the other person's shoes, but we're also aware that we're not them. And this is something that's the ability of ourselves to have that awareness is a controllable factor. So it's important to maintain that self-other awareness and not become completely enmeshed in the person's traumatic experiences. The second piece is emotional regulation. So emotional sharing or affective sharing is part of empathy, but we also can have some control over our ability to change or control the emotional experience we're feeling during that empathic process. So I like to think of it as kind of a volume knob or a dimmer switch, that self-other awareness and emotional regulations are things that can vary in intensity, and they're tools that can be used professionally and therapeutically, but they can also be turned back and lowered and even turned off. So while we're doing the affective sharing and the perspective taking, we got to recognize the self-other awareness, and we have to regulate the degree to which we're sharing those emotions. And then particularly after we disengage from that interaction, be able to dial down the emotional regulation, to begin to shut it off. Some of this will come back when we talk about self-care. All right, let's go back one, Jacob. Thank you. So empathy is both a risk factor and a protective factor. There's skills, empathic skills that can be learned and nurtured that will help. Another protective factor, just as with primary trauma and resiliency and post-traumatic growth, is the notion of social support. So having a social support network, family, friends, and even colleagues is a really important aspect. The higher our levels of social support, and particularly the more we engage and feel that that support is available, the lower levels of secondary traumatic stress that we see. I also like to talk about organizational support. So I weave the organizations in here from time to time. There are ways that organizations can convey and provide that same emotional and instrumental support that we talked about earlier. Part of that is, a big part of that is just simply being trauma informed and being, by extension, secondary trauma informed, recognizing and conveying to staff members that we as an organization recognize secondary trauma as an occupational hazard, and we're going to help you deal with that, put in mechanisms to minimize it, and be okay with working through that. Organizational support also comes through in certain professions and certain fields, supervision, clinical supervision, and having someone who can help you process the experiences you're having and talking about the other person's traumas. That can also occur through social support to a certain degree as well. When we move to the next few slides, not yet, but in a few minutes, what we're primarily going to talk about is self-care. I do want to underline, so the more engaged we are with various self-care activities, and we're going to break that down a good bit in a minute, the lower levels of secondary traumatic stress, the less intense it is, less severe it is, and that sort of thing. So we're going to come back to that in a minute. But the other piece about self-care, though, is I want to really highlight that you as individuals have agency through self-care to help yourselves minimize the impact of secondary traumatic stress on yourself. I would also say that organizational organizations have a responsibility and an ethic to be secondary trauma informed and provide that organizational support as well. So from my perspective, it's not okay for an organization to kind of say, do your self-care and leave it at that. Responsible trauma-informed organization will put in place procedures and an organizational culture that supports secondary traumatic stress interventions. And then the last piece I do want to mention before moving on to self-care is in some way similar to the notion of post-traumatic growth. There's this concept that compared to as opposed to compassion fatigue, that there's a notion of compassion satisfaction. And that is that the notion that though working with traumatized individuals may result in some negative impact on ourselves through the same things we've been talking about over and over: emotional response, physiological response, PTSD at the most extreme. It also, but we also can recognize often positive aspects of that work, so that we are satisfied with, we get a benefit from helping people who've been traumatized. We recognize that. We grow as a professional, we grow as individuals. And so compassion satisfaction is not just the polar opposite of compassion fatigue. They exist on their own continua. And higher levels of compassion satisfaction can reduce the levels or the negative impact of secondary traumatic stress. And we're going to come back to that in a moment. Okay, one more. There you go. All right. So this is my cool little diagram to show you how I conceptualize self-care. So that self-care involves awareness, balance, and connection on both the personal and professional level. Okay. All right, what do I mean by awareness? So awareness means a couple things, and I'm going to try to talk about both personal and professional all together when I talk about awareness, balance, and connection. And you'll see as we go forward, there's a connection between these three ABCs as well. So it's a way to try to elucidate these aspects for you, but also there's a lot of overlap with them. So it's not the perfect model. But awareness at the very basic level is awareness that secondary trauma occurs, that it's an occupational hazard, but also being aware that there are things that we can do, such as self-care, to help minimize it. Awareness has to do with recognizing and identifying those secondary traumatic stress symptoms and monitoring changes in your symptoms over time. So it's about taking stock for yourself on a periodic basis. Am I experiencing these symptoms? Is my experience of these symptoms impacting my functioning? So also recognizing and monitoring changes in functioning over time, because again, it's that link between the symptoms of trauma, secondary trauma, and it impairing us and causing clinical distress that we want to interrupt that process. Something to note as one thing that seems to be somewhat different when trauma is indirect rather than direct is that secondary trauma reactions, not always, but as a whole, as an aggregate, seem to be less or more dynamic, less ingrained. So once you hit the point of maybe meeting PTSD criteria for secondary traumatic stress, it becomes a little more challenging. But secondary traumatic stress symptoms go up and down somewhat dynamically. It has to do with who we're working with that day, that week, and so on. I like to get, the example I like to give is, I've done a number of presentations in educational settings to teachers and school counselors. And sometimes if I'm in person, I'll hand out the secondary traumatic stress scale and have people identify what their levels of secondary traumatic stress are. And in both teachers and school counselors and school social workers, there tend to be quite a few people who have experienced high symptoms of secondary traumatic stress whenever I interview them. But I did this one to school social workers, and they did the secondary traumatic stress scale, and they had really low levels. And I said, whoa, this is strange. What's going on? And one of them raised their hands and said, well, we had spring break last week. If you'd done this 3 weeks ago, I would have very different symptoms. So I say that to say that secondary traumatic stress symptoms can be very dynamic, and that's a good thing because they can be addressed and intervened on a lot easier. Awareness also has to do with knowing what your triggers are. I talked about triggers in terms of primary trauma for people for the clients that we're dealing with, that they have triggers that we need to recognize. For us, it's very individualized, but there may be aspects of a particular client, what he or she looks like, what their age is, what their family dynamics are, or the circumstances around their trauma, the traumatic events and the history that they experience that really get to us. So, we may have dozens of clients that are traumatized and we're able to manage, and then one comes along and there's some characteristic of that just kind of flips the switch for us. And so part of being aware is trying to understand what those triggers are and what those risk factors are for ourselves. And so when we're working with clients that have those, we will be more aware of how to kind of self-intervene and take, or know that we need to be taking better care of ourselves at that point. Awareness also has to do with being aware of the role of supervision and consultation in addressing secondary traumatic stress. Part of that social support and organizational support that we talked about, it has to do with supervision and consultation to allow us to talk about the trauma, talk about the negative aspects. The most effective interventions for primary trauma, for PTSD due to primary trauma, have a aspect of exposure to them in which the individuals process the trauma over and over to kind of disconnect the stimulus and the response cycle there. And that's part of what's useful in secondary trauma as well, is being able to talk to people about that, get support, have validation. So be aware of what opportunities are available to you through that. And if you are someone who experienced trauma in the past and you're currently continuing to struggle with that, to seek help with your own traumas, but be aware of how your own trauma history may impact your levels of secondary traumatic stress and how you work with others. Balance. So balance means a lot of things, but at the most fundamental, balance means balancing work life and personal life, making personal life a priority. A lot of you on the call, if not all of you, are very dedicated to your jobs and have really gone into this thing gone into your job and your profession to help people, and you want to help people all the time. But it is really important to continue to help people to not become impaired through secondary traumatic stress and burnout. And part of that is having that balance between a personal life and a professional life, and protecting that personal time that you might have. Attend to your physical and mental health. Engage in healthy activities. Eat right. Get good sleep. Take downtime. It is really, 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 did I say really, really important that you learn a way to disconnect, to do that emotional regulation from your job and from thinking about clients and their traumas when you go home. That is a necessary part of that. One way you can do that is, we'll talk about connection in a minute, through the various types of connection. In terms of professional life, if it's possible to balance your caseloads or your time or your tasks that are associated with traumatized individuals, either throughout the day, throughout the week, and so on, then that is a means to help balance things out professionally that may help with secondary traumatic stress. In not all situations is that possible, but if it's possible, it's certainly encouraged. And then the last piece of balance is to make sure you're taking time for relaxation and reflection. And I offer that certainly as part of one's personal life and home life, but also as part of professional life. It's important professionally to be able to reflect on the services that we're providing, and particularly about the positive aspects of what we're getting and what we're doing with that. Even if that time is just 5 minutes in between activities and meetings and so on, or 1 minute, but to really, mindfulness is part of what I'm talking about here. So being mindful of where you are and what you're doing and what your purpose is. Okay, let's go to connection. So the connection aspect is remaining connected and engaging in connection with family and friends, right? So how do you maintain that balance between personal and professional life? Part of it is through engaging and keeping ongoing and reintegrating your relationships with family and friends. Remember, with traumatic stress, and certainly secondary traumatic stress, part of the picture is self-isolation, withdrawing from the people that we get support from, withdrawing from the activities that we get enjoyment from. So the way to counteract that is to increase those, to make sure that we're doing that. Going back to awareness, being aware of the level of connection that we have. So there's a relationship between becoming less connected and increase in secondary traumatic stress symptoms. So as you're monitoring secondary traumatic stress, you also need to be aware of your levels of connection. Honor your connection to your community. We talked about with resiliency, community factors that play a big role in resilience and post-traumatic growth. And so they do as well for minimizing the negative impact of secondary traumatic stress. So that community can be lots of things too. We may have lots of communities that we're engaged in. And we need to engage all of those. And they may be virtual communities such as this. I'm going to mention this because it was missed before. Yes, thank you, Sarah. The PowerPoint will be made available to you. Okay, so revitalization, so connection also has to do with connection to your sense of purpose and meaning. Revitalize or re-engage that connection of why you're doing what you're doing professionally and personally. I know there are a lot of people on this call that went into helping people to make lots and lots of money. That's a joke. We all went into this to really help people, right? To do something good. And so it's really important that we realize that purpose and meaning and that connection. I'll jump into the last one here, but I'll come back. Part of that is, really make sure you're refocusing on the rewards of your work. Recognize, even particularly, I should say, during the challenging times and during the struggles, that you do have some rewards, that you're doing this for a reason, that you are helping people. During my time as a clinician, one of the things I did was I actually still to this day think about this, particular clients who really made tremendous strides in their lives. And I think about them as a touchstone to remind me of, even though the work was difficult at times, that I was really helping people in some way or another. Developing a personal connection, engaging with professional and personal networks. Again, that can be done virtually and in person. And definitely remember why you do what you do, refocus on the rewards of your work, and absolutely take time for yourself. So self-care involves all of this, the awareness, the balance, the connection, and all these aspects. And sometimes you're just as the symptoms of secondary traumatic stress may fluctuate, your level of self-care may fluctuate, your awareness, your balance, connection all fluctuate. That's part of the process, is taking stock periodically, not just in terms of what your secondary trauma symptoms might be, but how you are engaging. And the last piece I'll say about that is I think we also have a personal and individual responsibility to each other. Part of it is we are a community of helpers. We are a community that, when we see someone else who is struggling and might not be maintaining that connection or awareness, it's helpful for us to, through that social support, through that organization support, point that out and help them out and be supportive. Okay, so thank you very much. That's the end of my jabbering. I appreciate your being on the call.
Dr. B, that was no jabbering. That was amazing this morning and so timely. As you can see, the chat is just rolling over here. We do have a question from Zahir asking, are there any live videos or presentations online about working with secondary trauma that you might recommend to this group?
You know, I'm sure there are TED Talks and those sorts of things. I don't know. I don't know what those websites are, though. But I would say search secondary trauma and videos.
Excellent. Yeah, before we lose folks hopping off, you're welcome to pop any chats over here in the side. Yes, ESP had over 80 summer camp staffers online this morning. We had a great showing today.
All right.
Y'all, knowing that over 50% of us will experience a traumatic event in our lifetime, it's important that we obligate ourselves to understanding and to appropriate response. My name is Sarah McKinney, President and CEO of the Athens Area Community Foundation. As a public grant maker, it is our responsibility to understand how trauma affects our community. And we should seek to support organizations through funding that promote healing, awareness, and resilience in our communities. So that's why we at the Athens Area Community Foundation care so much about this work. We are building a trauma-informed care network of new champions through this grant, thanks to Resilient Georgia and the Patholic Foundation, working with Aaron Barger at Envision Athens and Dr. Grace Bagwell Adams at Athens Wellbeing Project. Jacob Lambeck and I are excited to help you become new champions with us. I consider myself a new champion of the trauma-informed care work, and I will be reaching out to you to help you feel how you can continue to engage with us in the work ahead. Y'all, we will make all slides and this recorded presentation available after this. Give us about a day to get everything uploaded to YouTube and online, and we'll send it out tomorrow. We'll also offer you just a basic certificate of attendance. This does not have CEUs for this particular course. We will explore that moving ahead, but we will provide a certificate of attendance for you all. Most importantly, please take the post survey that we will share in an email with slides and that recorded presentation. The survey is crazy important to us. Thank you again, Dr. Bride, for lending an incredible morning to us all. As you can see from the chat going crazy over here, this is probably one of the most timely presentations, and you have just been at the ready to share your knowledge and expertise with us. Thank you, thank you, thank you, Georgia State, Dr. Bride, Envision Athens, Athens Wellbeing Project, ESP for summer camp staff, trauma-informed care work, Croatia, Dublin, Athens, Ohio, Northeast Georgia, all of Georgia, the entire world. Thank you for helping us all become trauma-informed care individuals. Go be healthy, go be safe, and go be resilient. Thank you all so much.